You are now tuned into People City Council. I am your host, Jason Reedy. I am joined today by Albert Corrado.
People City Propaganda, sir.
Oh, what am I even saying? That's a long day at home.
How you doing, man? I'm doing good. Good to see you. How you been?
I've been all right. Took my youngest son, my only son.
Whoa, youngest. Oh, announcement, folks. Announcement.
To the LA Zoo yesterday, and
Love that.
We became members.
What does being a member get you?
It gets you unlimited trips to the zoo for the 365 days.
Oh, you're gonna go to the zoo a lot this year, huh?
You know, maybe like once a week. I think it's a good activity for him to, be able to see and look.
It's kind of a hilly zoo too, so you got to work out too.
You definitely get a
Mom and dad get their workout on. Baby gets to see a lot of cool animals.
Yeah,
you know?
he was like doing his little dances and like
I love
pushing the
that.
cart. So yeah, it was kind of workout slash, this emotional. I wouldn't say emotional, but just like a lot of his senses were activated.
Yeah, that's cool.
But anyways, yeah, we are joined today by Jacob Woocher. I said it right?
Yeah.
I said it right. Who is a tenant lawyer. He organized with the Los Angeles Tenants Union and is the author of the revered series LA's War on Public Housing, which you can read right now on Knock LA. That's the topic at hand today, but we'll dive into that in a second. Also, side note, you were once part of People City Council, correct?
Oh yeah. We were doing a lot of those car protests at the beginning of the pandemic. Going to Nuri's house.
Uh-huh.
We were way ahead of the time.
Yeah.
That one, I'll just say. And people try to tell us to stop, and those people can shut the hell up. Okay.
Yeah, you were an OG member. We were talking about this before we hit play, but like you were among the first, I think, was it 10 or 11 people that we had in the group?
Something like that.
Yeah, and then we were doing, it was the beginning of the pandemic and driving around to people's houses. I remember going to Garcetti's for the first time. It was like maybe 7 or 8 cars, and then later on that summer we had 200 people show up.
Oh yeah.
Good times, man. Well, I'm happy. You left us, but it's okay. I still have a lot of love for you, Jacob.
Definitely. Me as well for you all.
And if I could start off this podcast with radical transparency, I only read the first 8 parts of your series.
That's
so
a lot,
forgive
man.
me, man. I didn't read it. It's 10, right?
It's 10.
Yeah, so forgive me. I'm 2 parts behind.
I'd be surprised if at this point anyone's read more than that. To be totally honest,
You really think?
Even my mom has only read the first 2.
I mean, Jason. Wow.
I've read all 10.
Wow.
Yes.
Oh shit. Okay.
Yes, and I want to say thank you. It was truly informative. I really believe it's groundbreaking. I think you covered in your KCRW interview that this type of information just isn't readily accessible to the public. And so having it all in one place, just kind of like how Knock LA had the series on LASD gangs that Cerise put out, this is right along the same line. You really taught me a lot of things. And so
thank you for saying that. That's really nice. Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. And so how long have you had this concept marinating in your brain? I heard that you had started the research while in law school, but like if you could take us through, because this is extensive research that you did.
Yeah, it was a few years ago. First or second year of law school, I was trying to figure out what was going on with LA's public housing, right? Because like public housing seems important. The housing crisis is absolutely wild. Public housing seems like an obvious solution. Let's just build housing for people. The government should pay for it, tax the rich, defund the police, build public housing.
Hey.
Sounds right?
Absolutely.
But when you try to get into it and say, and look at what the deal is, there's very little that you can find. I mean, you can go to the Housing Authority's website and they have a list of some of the developments with the units and everything like that, but you don't really get a sense of like the history at all. There's almost no scholarly work on the history of LA's public housing after basically the 1950s.
Hey, now there is though.
Well,
what you did is scholarly, man. Like that you really, I want to echo what Jason said. You really made it like an accessible way to kind of get into like what I'm assuming is, pages and pages of like raw, boring ass data. You made it like really engaging and really, there are parts of it where I was like really pissed off. There were times where I felt like, I think I was just angry most of the time. I'm like, oh, the same shit they've been doing forever was being done all these years ago. So yeah, I think this to me is one of my favorite pieces I've read in a long time.
Well, thank you for saying that. There's been a little bit of stuff written on it. This one UCLA professor, Jacqueline Levitt, who's not around anymore.
Rest in peace.
Rest in peace. She did some great work on the Pico Aliso project, but other than that, there's mostly just news stories, right? And I don't know, it's like a first draft of history or whatever, so it's really helpful, and that's a lot of what I relied on, but there's nowhere you can go summing up, like, what's the deal with LA's public housing? Like, why don't we have more of it? What's the recent history of it? You know, what are the politics behind it? Like, what kind of people are influencing it? What has happened with the tenants? So yeah, it took a couple years. I was writing it for a while. It took me a long time to write. The editing process took a long time. Shout out to two people in particular, Johnny Coleman. Some people might know him in the organizing world, also a writer on his own. Johnny Coleman helped so much with the writing. Okay. And then Rachel Sanoff from Knock was like editor extraordinaire. Just, you know, it's like 30,000 words. It's a lot. So she did a ton of work getting all this stuff ready for publication. So I had a lot of help as well. I just want to make
Yeah, Johnny was an early organizing mentor of mine. Like when I joined Olympics, he was very much like, you know, kind of giving me a crash course on like Olympic organizing or anti-Olympic organizing. So shout out to him. And I know Rachel a little bit through doing stuff with Sela. She's very cool. So yeah, man, you got a great team. I mean, all white people, but hey, what are you gonna do? They were the only ones available at the time. And no, they do good work. I'm just you know, joking.
No, it's true.
Yeah.
And so you talked about cutting. Like, how much was cut from what you put together?
I think I had a first draft that was like, so for a while I had all this research and I hadn't actually sat down to write it because I was like, I don't have time to do this. And then I was like, all right, well, no one else is going to do it. Like, I might as well do it. I've done all the research. And I just like vomited all my thoughts into like a semi-structured narrative. That was probably like 40,000 words and it ended up being like 30,000 words. So I ended up cutting a little bit, but not that much. That's why it's still very long. Yeah, each article is like 3,000 words, which is maybe on a little long. Maybe I should have cut more, but yeah, no, there's not a huge amount left that I didn't get in there.
We'll get that in the special edition.
Uh-huh.
Is there at any point would you release it as a podcast?
I mean,
it would kill as a podcast.
It would be cool.
We have a podcast set up here, Jacob, if you want to do it in here.
True. This is my first podcast, so we'll see.
Wow, congrats.
Depending on how this goes, we'll see about it.
And so what's been the response like? Like, have you heard from people living in public housing? Like, yeah, what's been the general response you've gotten?
No, I mean, I wouldn't say I've heard from people living in public housing. I'm in touch with some people who have organized a lot in public housing, but don't live there themselves. Shout out Leonardo Vilches and Elizabeth Blaney.
Mm-hmm.
Just amazing organizers with Unión de Vecinos in Boyle Heights. I mean, they walked me through the whole story of the Pico Aliso redevelopment. So they saw these drafts from a very early point. But other than that, the reception's been pretty good. You know, a lot of people on Twitter are like, oh, it looks great, but it's hard to know how many people actually are engaging it with something like this. I think it takes a little bit of time, you know, to give time to people to read it, and we'll see. I mean, my biggest hope is that it puts public housing more on the map in terms of something to organize around, right? Like, I'm not just writing this history because it's interesting, which it is, or like I think it is, or it's enraging, which I think it is. But ultimately, like, I think this guy Karl Marx said something like, the point isn't just to interpret the world, it's to change it, right? So I hope ultimately the way people engage in this is thinking more about public housing, and, you know, like a one sentence thesis of the pieces, which it doesn't capture everything, but like, public housing is good, period. Like, public housing is good, y'all.
Exclamation point.
Exclamation point. Thank you. Yeah. So like, let's get more of it. Let's organize for more of it. We don't need to, you know, beat around the bush. And I'm sort of fed up with this term social housing. I think it's like basically meaningless at this point. And we can talk more if you want about why that is. But I really hope that the way people engage with this is think more about, oh shit, you know what? Why aren't we pushing for more public housing in LA? Like, why isn't LA building more public housing right now, and like the worst housing crisis we've ever had? You know what I mean? So that's the type of engagement I'm hoping for. Yeah, and we'll see. That takes time to happen, you know. So
how many hours do you think you spent like in the whole process? Like 1,000 hours, 2,000 hours?
Oh man, that's so hard to even guess. I don't know. That's hard. I don't have a great estimate. I mean, I'm trying to think. I wrote like the bulk of it probably the summer I was studying for the bar, but then it was a really long process of editing, which I would mostly do like on the weekends and stuff.
So you were studying for the bar and then writing all this at the same time.
I think so.
Damn,
I think
wow.
so. I had a couple months actually between the bar and between when I started my job. So that was maybe when it's hard to remember, dude, honestly.
Yeah.
Like
How long ago was that?
2.5 years ago probably.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, it took a while to get them like ready for publication,
Yeah.
which was also like an education for me. I've never done anything this big or anything like that. I've published like, standalone articles mostly in Knock. But this, there was like a lot of like professional sort of stuff going on behind the scenes from Knock. So I'm really grateful for them. And yeah, stuff takes time. So in the recent stuff, it was not as much time that I was spending, but like Rachel and the other folks. But yeah, definitely a lot of time. Honestly, it's hard to quantify.
Sure.
I've got these like 100-page Google Docs with just link after link after link, and I just copy and paste my notes into there, and like anyway. So those are pretty long. I got some like good documents, good research documents.
Yeah,
going,
yeah.
you
It was
know what I
amazing
mean?
to be able to go through each of the different parts, and you link it, and it links right to normally an LA Times article that just kind of details it. And so it was cool to be able to link into those. I have like a bunch of them saved that I'm going to go back and read.
Sure.
But yeah, it's really interesting.
One question I have, is there any, is there sort of, are you guys going to do this in Spanish at some point? I feel like the people affected probably would want that. I know it's an issue of like money and translation costs, all that, but has there been talk about that?
I was talking to Johnny about that. Johnny brought that up to me. I would love to. Yeah, I don't really know how to make that happen, but that would be super cool. I mean, so many people I organize with in the LA Tenants Union, like, are Spanish speakers, right? Yeah. And like, if you're talking about who in LA is most affected, well, definitely in public housing tenants themselves, but also just by the housing crisis, a lot of Spanish speakers. So that would be amazing. I don't really know how. If anyone's listening and wants to help out with that, like, hit me up.
No, for real. I mean, we'll do a fundraiser or something. I think with this could really be, because I think a lot of people who are interested in this world will love this, but I think people who maybe are like, oh, why is my public housing so shitty, or how do we get here? I think it'd be good for them, and it'll radicalize a lot of people, I think.
Yeah.
So yeah, let's make it happen.
For sure.
What would you say is the biggest thing you learned throughout this research and process? Like, what was the most surprising thing?
That's a good question. I think one of the really big things is that public housing has just been so at the center of like the war on drugs and the war on gangs and the war on crime and mass incarceration, where, whatever words you want to use to describe this phenomenon, where like we're putting like the United States, so many, mostly like Black and Latinx people in cages. Public housing's been central to that. Like, that was really surprising when I started doing the research. The way I started doing it was just basically putting the names of these different projects and searching them in like the LA Times database that I had access to actually you can still have access to it through the LA Public Library, which is dope. And every single article was like police raid, 40 arrested in like mass arrest, or like police sweep going after gang members and dangerous people, or residents fighting back against police killing. You know what I mean? Like that, it just immediately pops out at you when you're doing this research of how central the police repression is to these people's lives, and how central public housing is to this history of like mass criminalization and incarceration. I mean, there's been times when city council is debating, we really need to clean up certain hotspots in the city. Like, let's allocate millions of dollars for hotspot policing or whatever. And like 8 of the 10 places they target are public housing complexes. You know what I mean? And that was really surprising. I mean, of course, like, I guess it's not surprising in hindsight in some ways. Like, these are like concentrated, like very poor, very heavily either Black and or Latinx communities. So it's not surprising that like the LAPD and the city targeted them like this, but that shit just jumps out in the research. It's completely inescapable. It's like, I mean, I would say other than Skid Row and maybe certain like encampments, like these are the most repressed, most surveilled communities in Los Angeles. Like Jordan Downs in 2005 was the first residential community where they ever put surveillance cameras that stream footage directly to the LAPD. So imagine like walking out your door and like some cameras following you, and they can control them like joysticks. So imagine walking out your door and everything you do, you're just hanging with your friends outside. The LAPD is watching you, and now they have those cameras at every single public housing complex, or they're planning on installing them at every single public housing complex. I mean, anyways, we can go on and on about that, but yeah, that was probably the most surprising. I was coming into this just thinking, I'm going to write about housing. I'm going to write about housing policy and funding and, okay, privatization, sure, but then the police abuse and surveillance and repression is just like everywhere. Even, and you sort of got to read between the lines when you're reading like the LA Times and the Daily Breeze, which is the newspaper in like Harbor City, sort of San Pedro area. But even their accounts are like overwhelming with the amount of police repression and police violence that you see. Yeah.
And what was very interesting about the video at the different, especially at Jordan's Down, is it came with this promise of Wi-Fi, right? And it was like, damn, and they ended up not coming through with that promise. As throughout this series, we see a lot of different broken promises, right? But that would have been such an easy thing. Like you give them Wi-Fi and then you can surveil their Wi-Fi. Like that was a missed opportunity by the LAPD. When I was reading, I was like, damn, they didn't give them the free Wi-Fi. That was easy. I guess Jordan Downs is a real centerpiece of this series, right? And it was very interesting to read. The second part of the series is called Jordan Downs, A False Start for the Privatizers. Was this name an homage to Florence Joyner Kersey, the only female athlete to hold simultaneous world records in 100 meters and 200 meters respectively, both of which stand today, and who was arguably the most famous person to come out of Jordan Downs? Or was it also like related to Tom Bradley, who was a UCLA track star back in the day and was LA's first?
I didn't even think about.
Okay.
Any of that. I also didn't realize that she's from Jordan Downs.
Yeah.
Damn.
Yeah. She wasn't born there, but she grew up. I think she went there when she was like 5.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Okay, damn. So okay.
No, I love it though. That's exactly what I was going for. No, but it's called A False Start for the Privatizers because like they came into Jordan Downs in 1989 being like, we're just going to sell off this building. We're not going to tell the tenants about it. It gets reported in the LA Times that they have this plan, and clearly behind closed doors, like everyone's gotten on board with the plan, right? Tom Bradley, the mayor, is on board. These different developers are on board. The housing authority's pushing it. The LA Times editorial board is on board. But the tenants fight back, and within 2 months, they turn the tables and they sink it. So that's why it's a false start. Like they come in, they think they're just going to sell off Jordan Downs. Yeah. It's just so classic. It's like really what you see the rest of the series. They're telling the tenants, oh yeah, it's going to be kept affordable, but there's never any details. And then when pressed, they're like, oh, maybe 15 years? Like, I don't know. And the tenants are like, like what? Like you expect me to just be cool with that? Like no way. And then they do a lot of organizing. They protest at City Hall. While they're protesting at City Hall, Tom Bradley's in Australia for some reason, like trying to get investors. It's ridiculous. It captures a lot of the dynamics that you'll see for the rest of the series. And there was actually this like UCLA dissertation that was written all about this, which was really useful. And this guy, I think his name was Ronald Brooks. I have no idea. I've tried to Google him. I don't know what he's doing these days. Seems cool though. He seemed to like follow the tenants around and like go to their protests and stuff. And he wrote this really cool dissertation that provided a ton of the sourcing for this article.
Yeah, I felt like Jordan Downs to me when I was reading this. This was they learned from it. They were like, hey, we were defeated. They came together. We got to figure out our tactics. We got to finally tune them. And then they came back and like wreaked havoc all across Los Angeles.
That's so true. You constantly see the housing authority learning. They're very skilled and very sophisticated, especially under the recent leadership of Doug Guthrie. I mean, part of the amazing thing is in the 90s, they'll just say shit, right? Like they'll just say like, yeah, we want to increase property values. Like we want to like replace poor people with higher income people. We want to make this good for international investors. All of that was explicitly said in the Pico Aliso applications that they submitted to the federal government, for example. These are the housing developments in Boyle Heights, just east of downtown. These days, they don't say shit like that anymore, right? Yeah. They are much smarter about how they couch their redevelopment schemes. And they're really sophisticated in the way that they come in and they provide like different types of services. like grief services or you know, like adult education services, but only to the places that are getting privatized, right? So it's like, it's obvious why they're doing it. In my opinion, I don't think they actually care that much about the residents. Like, why aren't all the residents getting this type of stuff, right? But in Jordan Downs, they come in and they give all the, and this is when they target Jordan Downs again in like 2008, and especially starting in 2012 when Doug Guthrie, the current head of HACLA, comes in.
Oil tycoon? He's not
Yeah,
an oil tycoon. He looks like one,
he looks like an oil tycoon. Yeah,
he absolutely does.
Like
When you
Ted
pull
from
the picture,
Texas. One of the most insidious things, I think, is like they have this community coaches program where they pay residents to talk to their other. And look, people are free to have their own opinions about this. Like, I'm sure some people have totally good reasons for trusting the housing authority and being on board with this. But Al, just like you're saying, like they really do learn from the way this goes. And some of these programs they have are like totally meant to just tamp down on any criticism and any organizing that they might be afraid of coming up. Yeah.
And their message is going to come through better from someone that they know, someone that they live with, someone who they spent their whole life around.
And, you know, but it's the same sort of thing where it's like people in desperate situations will sometimes do things that are not, that maybe serve them and not serve their community. And they seem to capitalize. I mean, one thing I noticed in all the parts I read was like they seem to capitalize on that all the fucking time. They're like, hey, you know, we know that a certain percentage of people are going to accept these buyouts, so we're going to kind of account for that. And it's really hard to see, you know, what it must have been like for a family to accept a $5,000 buyout and say, you know what, this is my best option right now. I really wish I could fight, but I've got all this other stuff going on. And it's really insidious how these dudes do that. And it's still, I mean, again, it's only become more fine-tuned as time goes on.
Totally. Yeah, I mean, it's the same with organizing today, folks who are like getting buyout offers from their private landlords. Really similar. People don't necessarily know their rights and they don't know the resources that are available. And, you know, we're not programmed to like organize with our neighbors and get support that way, right? We're programmed to try to figure it out on your own. And absolutely, that's a big part of this history.
I was going to say, so Tom Bradley, you bring up this, he has this world-class
city.
World-class city. How did he go about pushing that vision into Los Angeles, and how did that affect public housing?
For sure, yeah. So Tom Bradley's whole thing was like making LA a world-class city. You know, I mean, I wasn't around during the Bradley years, but when you read, the guy must have been going around saying this all the time. Like in almost every article, he's talking about a world-class city.
Lock in arms, right?
Yeah,
like
yeah. Oh my God. Yeah, it's like Karen Bass saying lock in arms. Jesus Christ. Yeah, and what that means, I think, is making it a good place for rich people, white people, international investors who want to come in and get some fancy loft in downtown LA and, you know, enjoy all the good stuff that a world-class city has to offer. For the poor people, that means policing, it means gang injunctions, it means going to prison, it means get the hell out of our way because we don't want to see you here, right? This is after really intense deindustrialization of Los Angeles, so like thousands and thousands of factory jobs are lost. So you got, and especially in places like South Central, so you've got these big populations out of a job. What's the city gonna do? They police them, right? They send in Daryl Gates and his fucking white supremacist goons to like do these big sweeps where they just go in, and he tells the LA Times explicitly, like, we're going in and we're arresting people for every little thing we can. That's the strategy here. So Tom Bradley is often viewed as like progressive or at least liberal. You know, he and Gates were political enemies, and in some ways they were, but meanwhile, he's increasing LAPD's funding the whole time. The 1980s is a huge decade for the LAPD, going, you know, I don't have the numbers in front of me, going to way more officers than they had, way more budget than they ever had. For public housing, that means we're going to get rid of you when it's in our strategic interest to do so. So it's not like they're targeting every single public housing complex at once. I don't think they had the state capacity to do that, but they target Jordan Downs in 1989 because revitalizing quote unquote Watts is like a main goal for Tom Bradley. And you know, there's all this stuff going on at the same time. The Community Redevelopment Agency is declaring a project area in Watts, which is basically, that's the same thing they did in downtown, which allows them to funnel all these subsidies to like big developers. So they're trying to, do a similar thing in Watts of get businesses to come in and, displace people and, quote unquote, revitalize it, gentrify it, right? Like, I think that's a decent term to use these days, just to describe what they're trying to do. And I think that's the context in which to view the 1989 proposal to sell off Jordan Downs. It is part of revitalizing Watts, and that is explicitly what the Housing Authority executive director says at the time. This is like part and parcel of the campaign to revitalize Watts. So in understanding the city's approach to public housing, I think you got to understand Tom Bradley's quest for a world-class city, and then how that gets passed down to every single politician that follows. So they've all got the same thing. I mean, it's like a little bit reductive, but they're all the same in some ways. Like, they're all pushing the same ends. They all want land values to increase. They all want to bring rich people to the city. They all want to create jobs from, like, I mean, these days it's probably more tech and finance and stuff like that. It changes a little bit at the margins, but like from Tom Bradley to Karen Bass, you've got a really similar project of making the city a world-class city. Poor people be damned,
Yeah, world-class city always means more police for some reason.
Definitely.
Like, we're living, the uptick of all this stuff post 84 Olympics and what's happening now in the run up to the 2028. Like, I see a future for LA that is very bleak post 2028. Could you maybe, do you kind of see that happening as well?
Oh, 100%. Yeah. Thank you for bringing in the Olympics. I mean, that was, I think, a core part of Bradley's project. The Olympics was like something he can point to and be like, look, like, we are a world-class city. And obviously Garcetti's dumbass did the same thing with 2028.
Yep.
I haven't heard Karen Bass talk too much about it, but she's definitely not fighting it, right?
Yeah.
Like, I'm sure she's happy 2028 is coming. And I think these days it's less in the 80s and 90s, it was a lot about gang members, right? Like, gang members were like the evil that is afflicting LA, and we had to deal with the gang members, which isn't to say that gang violence wasn't real, but like, it wasn't the evil that's afflicting LA, right? I mean, and poverty is the evil that's afflicting LA.
Exactly.
These days, it's homelessness, right? It's unhoused people. So I think you're going to see the same exact thing, and you are seeing the same exact thing. The quest to build a world-class city is going to involve the removal of unhoused people from public space, and that's what Inside Safe, I think, is all about. That's what Karen Bass is.
That's what Mitch's fence around Echo Park Lake, I think, was the prototype
100%.
for what they plan to do, to make it look camera friendly and, get all the poor, gross homeless people out. I think that's they're trying to do it in MacArthur Park and all these other parks. But yeah, I mean, it's really horrifying to see that kind of stuff happening.
Totally. These through lines, like through history, just come right into the present. Absolutely. And they can, I think, guide our action going forward too. So yeah, thank you for bringing up the Olympics. I think that it's a really nice way to connect this history, and it's really similar dynamics. Yeah.
Someone that came up in this part of the series was Claudia Moore, who was the head of HRAC. I don't know if that's how you the Housing Authority Resident Advisory Committee, and was a resident of Nickerson Gardens. How much in your research did she come up, and there wasn't much that I could find on her.
Yeah. No, I mean, beyond these articles in which she's featured as like the main citywide public housing tenant leader, I couldn't find much on her, but she seems super cool. She's a Black woman from Nickerson Gardens. So she was leading this like resurgent public housing tenants organizing that was happening in the late 80s. And that was how the Jordan Downs tenants were able to fight the city. They weren't just fighting the city by themselves. They were fighting the city with all the other public housing tenants behind them. I mean, it's really amazing stuff. Claudia Moore is writing op-eds in the LA Times, like whatever, not to say that's the be all end all of everything, but she's writing op-eds in the LA Times being like, this is going to happen to every project here. Like, that's why we're fighting here. The housing authority is trying to, or the developers are trying to profit off of this land. She maps out exactly like what they're trying to do, like gentrify the neighborhood, right? They want the land value to increase, and by that time, all the poor people are going to be gone. So yeah, I mean, by all accounts, she just seems like an amazing, inspiring leader. Like you said, she was the head of the Housing Authority Resident Advisory Committee, which is a body made up of tenants from all the different public housing complexes. My understanding of the politics around these bodies is like, it's a mixed bag. I think sometimes people think these, and every development has their own RAC, Resident Advisory Committee. I think sometimes people see those as captured by the Housing Authority and like filled with like loyalists. Clearly that was not the case under Claudia Moore. I mean, she was fighting like hell against the Housing Authority and against the city. So yeah, she's an amazing person who people should know more about, and I wish I knew more about.
So we move on to part 3. No gangs, no blight, no Normont Terrace. I'll be the first to admit that I had no idea who William Whitty.
I think it's Witt. William Witt.
Can we get somebody to check that?
Witte.
You know what? I used to know someone with this last name, and it's Whitty. Yeah.
Whitty.
Weirdly, and this is Whitty, because this was one of my ex-girlfriend's uncles who was right-hand man to Rick Caruso. This is back in we stopped dating like 2011. So I didn't know
what
that
was her race?
She was white. She was white, her uncle was white, but he was like the number 2 or 3 to Rick Caruso, and I didn't know, I wasn't as politically inclined back then. So I was like, oh, Rick Caruso, the guy who makes the cool shopping centers. That's awesome. And now I'm like, I would.
The Grove.
Huh?
I still love the Grove.
The Grove is cool.
Okay,
the Americana is cool, but like art, artist, that whole thing, But yeah, so I think it's Whitty. I know from personal experience. He might. The guy's name was Bill Whitty, but I don't think he's maybe older than this guy. But
this guy's old, right?
I don't know if he's old. He's like probably in his 60s or 70s.
Okay.
Well, let's track him down one of these days and find out how to pronounce his name.
Get him on the pod.
I'll hit up my ex-girlfriend and be like, hey, I know we haven't talked in 10 years, but is this your uncle?
So you describe him, you describe him and talk about how he's kind of like in the background, and how that's probably on purpose. You name the 4 horsemen of the real estate tycoons, the most recognizable in Rick Caruso, Eli Broad, Jeffrey Palmer, and then William Witt, whatever the fuck his name is. Can you dive into who he was for our listeners?
Yeah, so
who he is.
William Witt / Whitty. He sort of flies under the radar, like you're saying. Like he's a major developer in LA. He's the head of Related California, which is some sort of offshoot or subsidiary of the Related Companies. The Related Companies is a massive, multi-billion-dollar real estate firm based in New York. The head of that firm, Stephen Ross, is like a major Trump supporter. Like these are, big conservative real estate players. William Whitty is now you got me all messed
Just call
up.
him Whitty. That's it. Just
Whitty is the head of Related California. Related California has profited and benefited from the privatization of public housing more than any other developer in Los Angeles. They were involved in the first successful privatization. And by successful, I just mean it happened. And it was certainly successful for them, for the developers. This is Normont Terrace down in Harbor City, close to the port. They redeveloped and privatized it in 1995. They were involved in the redevelopment, the demolition, and the mass removal of tenants from Aliso Village. Thousands of people displaced there. Related California was one of the lead developers for Pueblo del Sol, it's called, this new development in Boyle Heights. They're also currently redeveloping Rose Hill Courts. That's a smaller one, so I don't really write about it too much, but it's a 100-unit complex that's being redeveloped right now and privatized.
Where's that located?
That's in like somewhere in Northeast LA, like Lincoln, maybe a little bit like Lincoln Heights, El Sereno, I think. Okay. So Witt, he doesn't have the reputation of like Rick Caruso or Jeffrey Palmer, who are like these right-wing, arrogant pricks, right? Like I think they're pretty recognizable. Mm-hmm. He gets to be passed off somehow as like a policy expert. Like he was on a UCLA rent control panel a couple of years back, obviously arguing against rent control, but he's seen as a very respectable figure, I guess is what I'm saying. And I don't know if he deserves that type of treatment, right? The other thing that Related has done is taken so much public money for redeveloping Grand Avenue. So I don't know if you've seen that big monstrosity right across from the Walt Disney Concert Hall, the Grand. Mm-hmm. Like that's like the final project of the Grand Avenue project that Related has been the lead developer for. They got about $200 million in tax breaks for that building. Wow. So these people are just like sucking public money out of our coffers and pocketing it. And something I also talk about is they donate William Witt and Related California donate a ton of money to politicians and spend a ton of money influencing the city. So I guess I sort of start off with him as like the main character in this Normont Terrace article because I think people deserve to like know who this guy is. And I think people should be a little bit more outraged about how related California specifically has profited so much off of our public resources. And they're the first ones who redeveloped public housing.
Yeah. No, he's living in the shadows. You're exposing him. And I really appreciate, I wasn't familiar with his name at all. And another thing I wasn't as familiar with was this Hope 6 program. It's stylized with the Roman numerals, the VI.
Yeah.
Sounds like, my mind automatically went to Star Wars.
Yeah.
Can you describe for our listeners what the Hope 6 program is?
Yeah. Hope 6 was started, I believe almost certainly under Bill Clinton. I might get that one wrong. Basically, that's a big federal program for privatizing public housing, demolishing public housing, building like quote unquote mixed income housing in its place. In the 1990s, basically the federal government comes in and is like, we're not going to fund public housing, but we will fund destroying public housing. So the federal government is coming in the 90s and just giving a huge push to like all these local governments who probably want to do this anyways, right? Because and that's an interesting thing. LA was moving on Normont Terrace before Hope 6 ever existed, and was sort of boasting about this model they have where they're gonna demolish everything, lease the land to a private developer, and build like mixed income or like quote unquote affordable housing, and then so it's sort of an interesting interplay between federal and local policies. But yeah, Hope 6 is it's bad. They came in with a ton of money, and they would just give these like $50 million grants to different housing authorities to just demolish these complexes. Yeah, it's responsible for like, I don't have the numbers, but like hundreds of thousands of units being destroyed.
I think it was $150,000 that you put it, or maybe that I found in the research.
Units?
Yeah, over the last 20 years or something, or from '92 to 2012.
That sounds right. Yeah, and then there's been different programs since then too. Like under Obama, there's RAD, the Rental Assistance Demonstration, which is a little bit different, but they're all sort of the same.
Yeah, it's not RAD though.
It's not fucking RAD at all. Yeah. The whole point is like, we'll give you money to privatize this stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Damn.
From the feds, yeah.
From the feds. Can you talk about the federal government and how they've been involved in this in the war on public housing here in LA?
Yeah, I mean, they just grease the wheels at every point. I mean, it's interesting. There is a lot written about federal policy. So there's like, I mean, this guy Ed Getz wrote a really great book called New Deal Ruins about Hope 6 and sort of these other schemes. They're very much aligned with what the local governments are wanting to do too. And I think an interesting thing you see here too is like, it all is part of the sort of tough on crime bullshit that you see with Bill Clinton. And we have to evict drug dealers, we have to evict gang members. So they'll say some of these federal programs explicitly that like, yeah, we want you to evict all the bad people and like don't let them come back. Like they say that explicitly. Like they say that for the like Aliso or one of the Pico Aliso, because there was 2 phases for the Pico Aliso privatization. It's really explicit. They have something. There's like a press release that HUD put out. The Housing and Urban Development. Yeah. So the federal government is major. I mean, without the federal money, LA wouldn't have been able to do a lot of this stuff, I think.
Let's talk about Andrew Cuomo, because he did show up in this, I was surprised as Jason was to him. I was like, wait, this guy, he's been around for a long time, but he was weirdly involved in this stuff. So let's get into his sort of role in this.
Yeah, Cuomo pops up. I had to put him in there just because it's like, oh, that motherfucker.
Yeah.
Man, I'm not going to get this right. He was like the undersecretary of HUD or something. I don't think he was a secretary.
Assistant Secretary of HUD.
Assistant Secretary, thank you. Okay, yeah. And he comes in, and he's doing this like press con. They always do these press conferences, and he's giving a bunch of money. I think this was for Aliso Village, so that's the second phase of the Pico Aliso redevelopment in Boyle Heights, where like a ton of people got displaced, like over 1,000 people. And he's talking about, I think part of the quote I have from him is like, we need to bring in homeowners because that's really going to like change the dynamics of the community and incentivize. Basically, he's saying like incentivize these like poor people to start being better if they're like surrounded by homeowners, like responsible people, just through osmosis somehow. Like that's going to fix things. So just like the same reactionary shit. Yeah, it was interesting to see Cuomo in there too. I guess beyond being a creep, he's like a privatizer.
Full package, the full package, that motherfucker. So Jonathan and George Jackson often refer to the city of Los Angeles as a colony. And you bring up here in this part of the series the use of road blockades in Normont Terrace by the LAPD, where police would set up barriers at a corner near the project and inspect every car going in and out. How this was really like they were putting up blockades. Like this was, people talk about Palestine, talk about all these other places. Here in Los Angeles, in Normont Terrace, those same types of tactics were being used.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that framing in, because it's easy to get caught up in the details without like taking a step back, and I think naming it for what it is. Like, I mean, there are different analyses to put out there, but like, yeah, the city polices public housing and, poor people of color more generally as like colonized populations, right? And you see this really clearly. So yeah, like you said, at Normont Terrace, they would set up these road blockades where, and this is how it gets reported in the mainstream press. I mean, it's probably even worse than what they're actually doing, right? Or what they were probably doing is actually probably worse. Every car coming in gets checked, like searched, checking people's licenses. They would write down license plates if anything was suspicious. Imagine trying to do that in like Brentwood, right? Or like Westwood. Like that would never fly. That would never fly. And it's like a colonized occupation. Yeah, I mean that's absolutely what it is. It's the same type of treatment. So between the road blockades, massive police raids, there's just story after story of the cops just busting in like 6 a.m. and just nabbing people, like nabbing 40 people, and their neighbors are just like, I mean, some of the stories describe these people as like in their pajamas or in their like bathrobes, just looking at their community being, absolutely just, I mean, and that's why I call it a war too. I think, occupation, colonialism, war, it's all related. I really do think the city's like straight up waging a war on these populations. Yeah. And then you get the gang injunctions, and the gang injunctions are super important. I mean, that was part of like what surprised me in this research you asked, right? Is at every single development that I talk about here, which is like what, 6 or 7, I would have to count. Every single one except for Pico Aliso, there's a gang injunction either like very closely before the privatization or immediately after. So in Normont Terrace, I think the gang injunction's in 2000. So a couple years after everyone's cleared out, like 2 years after everyone's cleared out, they get an order from the court, because that's what a gang injunction is. It's like an order from the court, basically being like anyone who dresses in a certain way, who engages in certain behaviors like talking on the cell phone or like talking through a car window to someone, or like literally just hanging out with another person who's suspected to be a gang member, you can be picked up and like hauled to jail.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, these are some of the most like extreme legal measures to criminalize an entire population. And you see it at almost every single public housing complex. And, I think the whole point is to like, again, it's like to sanitize these different spaces, is to make them attractive for like whiter people, wealthier people, to get out the poor people who the city doesn't want around when they're building this world-class city, right? There's a great quote that I used from Stop LAPD Spying, their recent report, and it's like, white supremacy has to, I'm gonna butcher it, like everyone existing on land like has to be managed and has to be like colonized and policed like constantly under white supremacy. And I think that analysis plays out really clearly in all this history that we're looking at. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we're moving on to part 4, Pico Aliso. We shall not be moved. So the city of Los Angeles is the largest city west of the Mississippi River. The Wilshire Grand Center is technically the tallest building west of the Mississippi River, though many still are repping that U.S. Bank Tower.
Really? Wait, what about the Korean Air Building? I thought that was the newest one, the newest, tallest one.
Is it? Damn.
Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. I know they put like a little antenna to make it the tallest, but
Yeah.
doesn't matter.
count.
Yeah,
That
it doesn't
don't
matter. You're right.
And then, as you put, Pico Aliso is the largest public housing complex west of the Mississippi River. It is also the birthplace of Unión de Vecinos. What does Unión de Vecinos mean to you?
Oh man,
Like
Unión de
the
Vecinos means a lot to
Yeah.
me. I mean, I've got really close relationships with those people. So Unión de Vecinos is an organization based in Boyle Heights. That's like the heavily Latinx population just east of the LA River. And Unión de Vecinos was crucial in founding the Los Angeles Tenants Union, which I'm a part of. And they're still super active and super well organized. I mean, Boyle Heights is like maybe the most organized neighborhood in the city. If every neighborhood was as organized as Boyle Heights, like it would be a completely different city.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And that's, I think, because of Unión de Vecinos. So they come out of this 1996 struggle against privatization. It's really an amazing story, and I'm lucky to have Leonardo and Elizabeth who can tell it to me. The housing authority comes in, and we're talking about the largest development west of Mississippi, the largest public housing development west of Mississippi. I think it's 1,262 units across the different sort of like developments. I mean, it's all one development, but they sort of have different names. Aliso Village, Aliso Apartments, and Pico Gardens. And the housing authority comes in and they're like, okay, yeah, we're gonna redevelop and privatize Pico Gardens. Like, y'all are cool with that, right? And at first the tenants, nobody knows what's going on, right? Because people don't have experience with this. Like, they're not being told any details. And then in January of 1996, the first, I think it's 36 families get papers slipped under their doors saying, hey, you got to be out in 60 days. They're not eviction notices, but my understanding is they were like, hey, we need you to sign this agreement within 60 days to like be out in 60 days. And the housing authority is like, oh, we're offering them Section 8 vouchers. Of course they're going to do it. Like, who doesn't want to get out of this shithole neighborhood? You know, because that's how they talk about all these neighborhoods is like, they're gang infested, they're bad, nobody wants to live there. But then the residents keep fighting back to defend their homes, right? So like, obviously they do want to live there. These are their homes. Like, they have community there. Of course there are problems, but it's stable housing, it's decent housing. Anyways, and the tenants end up fighting back and forming their own organization with the help of a couple organizers who were working for the church that's nearby, Dolores Mission. And then the church decided to join the redevelopment effort. So they left the church.
Wow.
Damn.
And then helped form this organization with the tenants. And they fought like a really pitched battle for the next 6 or 7 years against the housing authority, and this is building on what I think is, in the record looks like sort of abolitionist or at least like proto-abolitionist organizing that they were doing against gang violence, but from the perspective of these are our community members. And like, we don't need more police coming in there. Like it's really the mothers. Like, we can take care of this ourselves. We can find the guns and take the guns away. We can hold like masses on the weekends and invite these people in so there's less violence. So that's happening in the early 90s, this really amazing organizing. So then by the time the privatization scheme is threatening their homes, like, they're ready. And they form Unión de Vecinos. The rest is history. I mean, because of this fight, about 250 people end up being able to move back in, or actually not back in, they never left. So they just refused to leave, and they end up being able to continue living at the redeveloped Pico Gardens. In the second phase, like Al was saying, this is like the housing authority learning from them. The housing authority is like, we're not going to do this phased, relocation plan where we demolish part of it and then you can move in and we rebuild and you can move into the new units and we go, part by part. We're just going to demolish it all like right away. And apparently they said that explicitly in a meeting with Elizabeth Blaney. They had said, look, we're not going to do that again. Like, we're just going to demolish everything. Yeah. That's when thousands of people get displaced. Sorry, your question was about Unión de Vecinos. So it's an amazing organization. They're also like the East Side local of the LA Tenants Union now, and they just keep it super real. They're amazing organizers. They're amazing thinkers, and yeah, I'm super inspired by them.
Yeah, you mentioned how tenant organizers in LA are pretty militant, and like that is true. Like, I feel like tenant organizers in LA get down. Like, they show up for their people. They get in the way of the police and landlords. Like, it is a really proud tradition. And I've met a lot of people from Unión de Vecinos, and they're fucking badasses. Even, these older Hispanic people just being like, whatever, man. Like, I really hope to kind of emulate that as I become an older person. So shout out to them.
Shout out.
Yeah.
And Leonardo has a son too that also organizes.
Yeah, Leonardo the Younger. Yeah. Shout
the
out
Younger.
to him.
Yeah. So going to part 5, raising the barrio. So organizing takes many forms, and sometimes it doesn't bear fruits for even years or even decades. And you write in this part, the Pico Aliso tenants had spent years fighting against the LAPD's war on gangs. This is why when the time came to defend their homes, they were able to mount such a sustained resistance to the housing authority, so committed to their removal. Why is it important for our communities to organize instead of mobilize?
Good question. Yeah, I mean, that organization is what forms a foundation to have any chance of mobilizing. Like, you can't just mobilize without that organizing, right? So, you know, like I was talking about, this is years and years of building really real connections with their community and developing an analysis too that I think was super important, and that I'm grateful for, because I think it's an analysis that the LA Tenants Union still has, and which is like, these institutions that are supposed to protect us don't protect us, right? Like, whether that's the LAPD, obviously, like the housing authority, the city council, the church, like they were super organized with the church, and there was amazing work happening with the church and with Father Greg Boyle, sort of this, like, you know, like I said, this like peace organizing to try to prevent gang violence. But then when the privatization came, I think this is, it's sort of shameful, but yeah, Father Boyle was like totally on board. And I don't think it's a stretch to say that he was totally on board, partly because of personal interest, right? Like, there in the archive, there is a letter from him to the housing authority saying, I support, and this is a second phase, I fully support this redevelopment effort, and I would love it if you give me some contracts. I would love for, at this time, it was called, I think, Jobs for a Future, something like that, Jobs something. It was the predecessor to Homeboy Industries. They want to be part of the housing authority's like redevelopment scheme, you know, and he, even in the press, sort of like slandered the tenants and Unión de Vecinos. So that history is really unfortunate, but the tenants organization and the tenants analysis made it so that they didn't fall for these like tricks. And, you know, all the establishment figures, these nonprofits, the city council, they're all telling them this is going to be great for you. And they're like, no, it's not. Like, we know it's not going to be great for us. This isn't for us. So you only get that type of mobilization with the organization that comes first.
And it's easy to get caught up in that, right? You have all these people in positions of power telling you, like, nah, this is how it's going to go. And there was an interesting quote that you included from Father Greg Boyle. When he was talking about Unión de Vecinos, labeling them as irresponsible, I don't think having poor people piled on top of poor people is what God had in mind. And for me, it's like, man, I understand your father.
Yeah.
Why you got to bring God? Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like trying to, you know, sanitize your viewpoint on this through the eyes of God and bringing God into the mix. So.
But then also using God as a reason to be an asshole is like such a classic thing that people have done forever, and that's just another example of it. Like, yeah, I'm going to be an asshole because my interpretation of it means this. It's fucked up.
So in this part, you write relocation and the right to return were again the major issues, and that's a reoccurring theme throughout.
Yeah.
When it comes to the right to return, why is that like so difficult for them to commit to?
That's a good question. I mean, partly it's because the fundamental purpose of these schemes is to get out like the poorest of the poor, right? And it gets replaced with this quote unquote affordable housing that's for people making more like $80,000 or like $100,000 a year, as opposed to the public housing families who are making like $20,000 a year on average. So I think it's a feature and not a bug of these privatization schemes that they're trying to remove the poorest of the poor, right? Like the most, whatever, the riffraff, however they think of them. But it's a good question. Yeah, why don't they just let people return like otherwise? I mean,
it's like the bare minimum, thing that they could guarantee.
Yeah. And you see that over and over again. I mean, at the first phase of Pico Aliso, like they had to fight like hell just for 250 of them. And again, they didn't return. Their whole strategy, they realized, was like, once they leave, they're not, how are you going to, maybe you have a piece of paper. Well, that's the funny thing too. Actually, the housing authority literally gave people a piece of paper that said certificate of guaranteed return.
Oh my God.
And then when asked about it by the LA Times, they're forced to admit like, oh yeah, this doesn't mean anything. It's like a fucking joke. So at Pico Aliso in the first phase, people just don't leave. And that's why 250 of them are able to stay. In the second phase, yeah, like you said, they're fighting for the right to return, the right to never leave, whatever, however you want to put it, the right to live in the same location that they were already living in. And that didn't happen. That didn't happen. The vast majority of them got displaced. We're talking about 685 families. I think the estimates I've seen are like maybe 50 families were able to return. So that's over 600 families. Let's say three persons per household, right? Like 1,800 people displaced. They were, I think given maybe Section 8 vouchers or sort of different types of counseling to try to find other housing, but the housing authority basically would just refuse to make any sort of commitment of like, oh yeah, you will be able to move in. It's like, maybe you'll have priority status, like whatever the hell that means, right? Yeah, sure, we'll notify you when you can apply for the new housing. And it's like, that's not doing anybody any good.
And didn't it come with a lot of caveats of like qualifications if you wanted to do that? Like,
yeah.
You have to have, I think I read it was like 5 years of good credit, or like even immigration status would be checked. I mean, it's really fucked up what they tried to do.
Absolutely. I mean, this is what like Elizabeth Blaney described to me during the Pico Aliso process. It was always filled with caveats. Like, and then like you said, these days, and then too, I mean, the private developers, they screen applicants for stuff exactly like you were saying. If you have an eviction on your record, like you're probably not gonna get this housing. If you have bad credit, which is like, you mean you're poor. So like I said, by design, the poorest people are excluded. If you have a criminal record, the most vulnerable people are excluded. If you if I forget exactly what they say about immigration status, but some of these private developers, like if you don't have, your immigration status in check, you're not going to get housing.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's all these caveats, all these ways in which they screen out certain populations that aren't seen as desirable.
Can you I want to talk about this term affordable housing that we kind of see everywhere. And I've always found it to be a nebulous, kind of useless term, because affordable could mean three different things to the three of us, right? So, I mean, what does that even mean in these instances? What does affordable housing actually translate to?
Yeah, good question. So affordable housing is, like you said, it's like this broad term that just refers to a number of different models for providing housing that isn't purely governed by the market. So there's different formulas, like the developers have to keep rents below a certain level, or they have to rent to people with certain incomes. There are a lot of problems with affordable housing. One is that the affordability agreements expire. So that's what you're seeing with the Hillside Villa tenants right now in Chinatown. Their building was quote unquote affordable for 30 years. So the rents had to be kept below a certain level. And then all of a sudden in 2018, people are getting notices that their rent is going to go up by like 200, 300%. That's a major problem with affordable housing. Another one that I think is super stark in the context of public housing is, like I said, it's really targeting people with higher incomes. So like people who make $60,000 a year deserve to have lower rents. Like absolutely, the housing market is so nuts right now. It's not fair to say that only the poorest of the poor should have low rents or like subsidized rents in some capacity. But let's be clear, like there's a difference between a family that's just scraping by on welfare who needs housing and a family that's making like 60K, 80K, 100K. So a lot of the quote unquote affordable housing, I mean, from my understanding, unless it's like specifically for people experiencing homelessness, almost all of the affordable housing, quote unquote, is going to be for people making like 80K or above in the city of LA, because they use these formulas that are based on the entire county essentially. And LA is a super wealthy place. So like the rich people really drag that number up. So, someone making 80K or 100K is like quote unquote low income. That's another problem with affordable housing. You also see these developers, like I was saying, just like screening people out, right? So public housing is really serving the most vulnerable people. These developers are not trying to deal with like you said, people with bad credit, people who are going to have trouble paying rent. Like, isn't that the whole point of this program is to like help people who need that help? But quote unquote affordable housing is not designed to do that. I mean, I think honestly it's designed for the private developers to collect rents that are like heavily subsidized by the public. And I think a major player here is the financiers. So like big banks like Citibank, US Bank, Bank of America, who are funding these projects to the tune of like tens of millions of dollars. So this is land. I mean, I think one way of just looking at this straight up is like, this is land that prior to privatization was not being invested in. Like nobody was profiting off of this stuff, right? There's not like, I mean, maybe some contractors here and there or whatever, I don't know. Then when you privatize it, it's like Bank of America comes in and provides a $100 million loan. They've got interest-bearing capital going there. So like this is the mass opening up of acres and acres of prime land to speculation and investment. So all that is within affordable housing, as opposed to public housing, which is owned and operated by the public. It's not perfect. It's been underfunded for years, but it's stable and it's decent. And I think it's a lot better than having a private landlord in a lot of ways.
There was a part in the series where we talked about, I think it was like in the early 90s, that it would have cost $100 million to fix all the different issues at public housing, and how the city didn't want to allocate that $100 million, but they were perfectly fine giving $500 million to the whole
Convention center.
The convention center. Yeah.
Yeah, no, thanks for bringing that up. That's at every point in this history, it's been a choice to not fund public housing, right? Yeah. Like the LAPD's budget is what, $3.2 billion right now? The latest estimate for how much money it would take for the capital needs for public housing right now is $533 million over 20 years. So 1% of the LAPD budget diverted for the next 20 years could fully fund the rehab of all public housing in LA, right? This is a choice. And it's the same thing that was happening in the 80s, like you're saying. Like they chose to borrow $500 million from the bond market. And I think we're still paying interest on that today. Like I think the most recent number I could find was maybe like a couple of years ago. I think the city paid $40 million or something out of the general fund.
Oh my God.
For the debt taken on for the convention center in the 1980s. At every point, it's been a choice to underfund public housing because they want to spend money on shit like the convention center, Staples Center, like Walt Disney Concert Hall, all that sort of stuff for like rich people and for tourists, and obviously the LAPD. At every point, you know, you take some money from the rich, take some money to the LAPD, you're not going to have problem funding public housing.
Yeah.
You know, we were talking about numbers, and so LAHSA deals with so many different numbers. Why is it that they don't have a concrete number of how many families have returned to these public housing projects?
Totally, yeah. So for each thing, you know, I'm doing my best to figure out what like the official figures are. Like, oh, okay, they must have kept track of somewhere. Okay, well, you know, we rehoused X number of the Pico Aliso tenants or like the Dana Strand tenants, and every single time it's like I do a Public Records Act request. Shout out to Kevin Wong, who's my guy at the Housing Authority, who always answers the public records request. Kevin Wong's gotten so many emails from me. They never have any records on how many people have been replaced. They're starting to do that. Actually, it's interesting though on the Jordan Downs redevelopment right now. Like I said, they're getting slick. Like they really know how to market this stuff. So they are publishing quarterly updates about how many people at Jordan Downs have chosen to take a voucher or chosen to be rehoused in like the new housing. And you know, it's really hard to know what's actually going on behind the scenes there. Yeah. So they're starting to be more upfront about these numbers of like how many people are moving back in to the redeveloped housing. But yeah, for the first, you know, 3 redevelopments that happened, there's just nothing. They don't have any records at all.
Do you think it's because the numbers are so low, probably? And they're just trying to save face?
It could be partly that. I also just think they didn't give a fuck.
Yeah.
Like, they just they didn't even care. So it's hard to know though. Yeah.
Hey everybody, it's Albert, one of the hosts of this show, just here to say that this is the first part of our 2-part interview with Jacob Woocher. Part 2 drops next Wednesday, so look for it on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, and everywhere this podcast is found.